Craft matters. In small ways, like how a coffee is brewed. And in not so small ways, like how your money is cared for. Which is why for 160 years, UBS has elevated banking to a craft. Tailoring unique strategies that combine human expertise with the latest technologies. All happening across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs. With you at the heart of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 3rd of December 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist. I'm Vincent McAviney. Coming up, President Macron heads to China. Can he bolster flagging Sino-Franco relations? Then to the Caribbean. Is US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in legal trouble over boat strikes?
The Secretary assembled hundreds of admirals and generals. He said, "You exist to break things and kill people."
We'll hear how Canada has managed to beat Britain into the EU Defence Fund. And Tom Rowntree, VP of Global Luxury Brands at IHG, pops into our pop-up radio studio at the International Luxury Travel Market in Cannes.
That's never happened before in the history of travel, ever, that we've had 7 generations travelling. So all of those ingredients absolutely are hopefully painting a rosy picture for the future.
Plus, we dissect the day's papers, get a roundup of the latest fashion news, and find out which city has come out on top for cyclists. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. 5 hours of talks between President Putin and President Trump's senior negotiator appear to have failed to produce a breakthrough on securing a Ukraine peace deal. India has ordered all new smartphones to come preloaded with a state-run cybersecurity app, sparking privacy and surveillance concerns. And Pope Leo led a silent prayer at the site of the Beirut port explosion and demanded justice for its victims as he wraps up his 3-day visit to Lebanon. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. But first, French President Emmanuel Macron has travelled to China for a 3-day visit, looking to strike a balance between protecting strategic industries and security interests during a time of global trade turmoil. I'm joined now in the studio by Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast journalist and the former CNN Europe editor, and down the line with Howard Zhang, journalist and former head of the BBC's China service. Nina, first to you, what's the itinerary for this visit?
Well, there's going to be a visit to the Forbidden City. There's also going to be some cuddly panda diplomacy as well on the agenda over the next 3 days, as you pointed out. This isn't the first time Macron has been to China. In fact, among the EU leaders, he's been one of the more frequent visitors during his time. It's his 4th visit to China, and the Chinese themselves are making quite a lot of that. If you read some of the state press over in China, they're really making the point that Macron comes time and time again to China, and that just cements China's position in the world. But as you pointed out, there's trade to talk about and some other awkward conversations that Macron has to have on behalf not just of France, the EU's second biggest economy, but also he's speaking to a certain extent for the other EU member states as well, because the EU has a 300 billion euro trade deficit with China, and France, for instance, just that economy itself, 46% of its own trade deficit comes from trade with China. So there's a lot at stake here, and essentially what he wants to do is sort of reset the balance. Will he be successful? The jury's out on that though, Vinny.
Well, Howard, let's just focus in first on that Sino-Franco relationship. How healthy is it currently? Lots of visits, as we heard there, but are things in good order?
Very much like Nina just said, there's a lot of very subtle details hidden in there. On the Chinese side, I think what they most want from this visit is some type of appearance that France and Europe is not totally on U.S. side. I think that's what the Chinese side care the most. And they are locked in this global rivalry with the U.S. And in many aspects, if you read the Chinese newspapers and read all their media reporting, they're talking about somehow they like the French thinking of a more independent diplomacy. And I think that's where there's the reason why there's so many more visits. They like this type of visits, and they want to show the world that China is not alone on this one.
And Nina, Macron and President Xi have been around on the international stage for sort of a decade at the top level. Do we know much about their personal relationship? Because they'll have met each other not just on those visits, but also at international summits.
Well, so that's an interesting one, because obviously remember that Chinese diplomacy is highly choreographed, because there's huge amounts at stake for a country like that, let's face it, doesn't face the same democratic limitations that Emmanuel Macron faces back home. Remember that he's lost his parliamentary majority, so he's really a sort of lame duck French president. He's heading into the last year and a half of his time in office, or maybe even 1 year, because he's got to leave office in 2027 and cannot run for another third term. So this is kind of Macron's diplomatic swan song, if you like. And he is, to a certain extent, encumbered by the limitations of democracy. Which Xi Jinping himself isn't, especially Xi versus other Chinese leaders, because he's very much changed the system towards his legacy and his benefit for the future inside China. But the thing that we have to remember here is that China has, throughout the course of not just Macron's time in office, but other EU leaders' time in office previously, continued to subsidise certain industries that have eaten away at core industries in Europe that are very emotive ones that really chime with the electorate. And in particular, autos, and in particular electric vehicles, and steel, which is a very, very emotive one for France, and in particular Germany, and also China's stolen march on the EU when it comes to green technologies. So those are the kind of industries that Macron will have to try and defend, not just on the behalf of the French industry, but also on behalf of the EU as well. He's taking with him a whole trade mission of the usual French executives, big companies in the aerospace and defence industry. He's hoping to make some deals for French companies in food, and also certain energy sectors, as I said before. But France is in a really interesting position on this one, for the main reason that, unlike Germany, it doesn't have a huge combustion engine car footprint with China. But on the other hand, it has faced retaliatory action from China, with its spirits and wines being targeted by punitive actions each time the EU tries to sort of curb and clip China's wings when it keeps trying to spread into those crucial markets like steel, electric vehicles, and also green technologies in the EU.
Howard, you're seeing a lot of Chinese EVs across Europe now, but Chinese consumers have long been known for their hunger for French luxury brands, and you'd see the likes of Louis Vuitton and others heavily in China. That appetite, though, has cooled slightly. Is there anything Macron is going to be doing on this trip to try to boost that trade once again?
Macron definitely will try, like Nina pointed out, on the EV side and on some of the other French products. But the Chinese demand cooling, it's not something I think even the government can help at this very moment. But French delegation would definitely try, because they want to show they can still deliver something for the French industry. And Macron's 2023 trip did not end too well, even in the French media, and did not taste too well in Washington because his emphasis on diplomatic autonomy. And now, so this time is something to make up. And then I would just to add, there will be some type of a symbolic mentioning on Ukraine and Taiwan. This is almost many experts I read in the think tanks are commenting on this. So one would expect at least the French president, however lame duck he is now, will try to push on that one, see if he can get something out of it.
Well, you've preempted where I was turning next, to security matters. Nina, France has been a strong supporter of Ukraine, Macron hosting Zelensky in Paris once again on Monday. China has, however, sort of tacitly supported Russia's illegal war. Do we expect any discussions on the conflict and Putin's sort of renewed aggression towards Europe?
Well, one can assume that there's going to have to be some sort of discussion, because says essentially China has, as you pointed out, even in second position behind the scenes, helped to underwrite Russia's ability to continue to wage this war in Ukraine, not just by providing access to dual-use technologies and spare parts that Russia needs, but also to continue to buy that Russian oil. And that keeps the Russian economy, even if it's in the doldrums, afloat in a way that Vladimir Putin can just continue to wage this war and what is becoming a war of attrition, peace efforts in Moscow notwithstanding over the last couple of days. So Macron will probably, one would assume, have to try and impress upon Xi Jinping his vision of how badly this war needs to end soon, and it needs to end well. That said, as Howard was just pointing out before, there have been some big diplomatic curveballs, and EU officials are quite nervous about this visit as a result of the 2023 visit, when Macron just suddenly got on the plane to come back from China and started pontificating on Taiwan and making all sorts of uncoordinated diplomatic statements. There's real concerns here that Macron needs to stay on message. He cannot go rogue on issues like Ukraine. He cannot break ranks with the EU, if you like, and he needs to also get China to try and make at least some sort of oblique recognition that this war needs to end sooner rather than later, because as I was saying before, Russia can continue to wage this war and a war of attrition if China continues to trade so much with Russia.
And Howard, just finally, sort of, what is the Chinese position and also the sort of Chinese public's view, as much as we can ascertain, on the war in Ukraine and the sort of support that Russia receives from China, but also that question of Taiwan? Do we expect there'll be much discussion?
On the Russia side, Russia-Ukraine war side, the Chinese public is pretty much split. If you talk about the online reactions, the majority are supportive and condemning NATO, whipped up by the propaganda machine. And if you speak to people in private, quite a few people are not happy about Russia's action in Ukraine, but their voices don't really count. And in terms of Taiwan, I would say there's a huge tsunami of nationalist voices being whipped up in the propaganda sphere as well. So it's very difficult to say what the real people actually think. Even, officially, privately talk to them, they're unwilling to even say anything against the government line at this moment.
Well, Nina Dos Santos, former CNN Europe editor, and Howard Zhang, former head of the BBC's China service, thank you for joining us. This is The Globalist. In the Caribbean, where the US has carried out some 20 strikes on alleged drug boats from Venezuela, US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is alleged to have given a verbal order to kill everyone, a charge that he denies. Instead, the White House has sought to place the onus on Naval Admiral Frank Bradley for ordering a so-called double-tap strike, a second strike on the same ship in the Caribbean, with the sole aim of killing 2 survivors of the initial attack. US lawmakers are now investigating this action as a possible war crime. Monocle's Chris Chermak spoke with General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of the US Army in Europe, about the strikes in the Caribbean. Chris began by asking what the chain of command looks like in an operation like this and how involved the Secretary of Defense would have been in setting its parameters.
Well, I hate to say it depends, but it really does depend. I mean, there's a degree of micromanagement that goes on in everything. It used to be in Afghanistan that the commander there once a week was on a video call with the president, whether it was President Bush or President Obama. The Secretary of Defense obviously gets very involved in these kind of things. So ideally what happens is that there's a strategic end state, there's a plan for how you're going to do this, and then the secretary depends on his military commanders to carry out the military part of the task. Normally, tactical decisions are made by tactical commanders. Now, in this case, of course, these are not just normal operations. A question for me has been, what are the rules of engagement? Now, we don't typically publish the rules of engagement because they are classified. You wouldn't want to communicate to the enemy what your limits are. But I haven't heard anybody talking about rules of engagement here. And the rules of engagement are designed to help accomplish the task within a legal framework. And in this case, the secretary, of course, would have had to have approved the rules of engagement. if they're there. I don't know. I doubt that the secretary is directly involved in each strike on each boat. I mean, there's been 20 of these, but I mean, Rumsfeld was famous for very specific guidance on very specific things. So I would not say that Secretary Hegseth was not involved. That would not surprise me if he was involved.
General Hodges, you mentioned rules of engagement there. That's something we've talked with you about before, the fact that this Secretary of Defense maybe doesn't hold those in quite as high regard as previous Secretaries of Defense. This is at the heart of it, as you say, what the rules of engagement might have been. There are these allegations that the Secretary of Defense had a kill order, essentially. Can you ever imagine a situation where an order to kill rather than simply to target would be justified?
Let's go back to Quantico. You remember this famous meeting where the Secretary assembled hundreds of admirals and generals, and he specifically, and this gave me a chill when I heard it, he said, "You exist," pointing to the audience, "you exist to break things and kill people." That is a, let's call it commander's intent or a cultural sort of statement. He's creating an atmosphere of expectation. Now, how that gets acted out or played out, and how does that translate into actions and orders, that's a different story. But just to be clear, the Secretary has been very busy for the last 24 hours trying to create distance between himself and the Admiral by saying the Admiral's a great hero, I'm with him, I stand by, or, you know, what he did in the performance of his duties, his orders. I mean, this is clearly the Secretary dumping the whole thing on top of the Admiral. But it was the Secretary that created, or is attempted to create, an environment of you exist to break things and kill people. So that's an important part of this. And then in that same meeting, he also said, we're getting rid of woke rules of engagement. So it's not a long walk to get from that to destroying boats at sea without knowing exactly who's on board those boats, or to even do the so-called double tap to strike and finish off the two survivors who were there.
General Hodges, there's been a lot of discussion, not just about this particular strike, but also because of an ad by Democratic politicians, frankly, about this idea of whether the military should follow commands that they consider illegal. And that's what you're getting at here as well. It did make me wonder, I mean, can we really expect members of the military to disobey orders? How easy is that? How conscious were you of that reality in your own work and time in the military?
Well, so as you know, I'm a pretty old guy. I'm 67. I started at West Point in the summer of 1976. So really just a couple of years after the end of the war in Vietnam. So the My Lai massacre was still fresh in the minds of all of us. And so I can remember sitting in a class being lectured about my responsibility not to obey an unlawful order. And in fact, the phrase that was always used, it was called the Nuremberg defense, which is, of course, what the Nazis on trial in Nuremberg after the war said, that, you know, we were just following orders of the Fuhrer. And of course, that didn't work as a defense. And we use that phrase in the U.S. military, Nuremberg defense will not protect you from carrying out an unlawful order. It is your responsibility, Cadet Hodges, Lieutenant Hodges, Major Hodges, General Hodges, it is your responsibility to know the difference between a stupid order and an unlawful order. Now, of course, it's easier to say than to do. Usually, the kind of orders that we're talking about are not going to be quite so black and white. But if it's in the case of something that's a little bit on the margins, it's not quite so clear. Well, you know, these are narco-terrorists. We're defending America from a terrorist invasion. And that's the language that the administration has tried to use here. And it's also instructive that Secretary Hegseth removed the top legal officers in each of the services, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, Judge Advocates General. They were all removed at the same time without cause early in his tenure. Why would you remove all three judge advocates general unless you were trying to change the culture, send a message about, what we're going to do.
General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of the US Army in Europe, in conversation with Monocle's Chris Chermak. Still to come in the programme. For those who like going places on two wheels, we reveal the best cities around the world for cyclists. This is The Globalist.
Craft is a matter of perspective, a unique outlook, an obsessive attention to detail. With UBS's Chief Investment Office House View, we're focused on identifying the latest investment opportunities and market risks to help you achieve your financial goals. So you get the big picture broken down into thought-provoking insights. Delivered daily and curated by over 200 globally connected, locally active analysts. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Well, let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me is Simon Brooke, freelance journalist and communications consultant. Simon, good to have you back in the studio. What's caught your eye?
Yeah, well, the New York Times is one of a number of news outlets, as you can imagine, covering the peace negotiations in Moscow with Steve Witkoff, also known by some as Steve Witless, and President Trump's brother, son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And according to the New York Times, negotiators discussed the substance of US peace proposals, but did not delve into any of the wording of the provisions, reach any specific compromises, or agree to a new summit between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump. So many people, myself included, you might agree, would read that as meaning no progress at all. I think it's also interesting that the report includes quotes from what's described as the Kremlin's top foreign policy aide, Yuri Yushakov, who says the discussion was very useful, constructive and very substantive and lasted not for 5 minutes, but for 5 hours. Now, again, I think many of us might read that as being an example of Vladimir Putin's love of lecturing his visitors, his theories of the history,
his
of
rewriting
Ukraine.
of history,
absolutely, exactly, in his own version of it, and also playing for time. And I think there's something about this comment that it lasted for 5 hours, not 5 minutes, which is almost sort of teasing the West and just saying, look, we're just playing for time. That's all. And I think if you put this into the context, obviously, of recent coverage or recent events in Ukraine, then it does appear that Putin does seem to feel that he is that he's making the running here, that on the battleground, that he has some success. So he's probably feeling quite confident. And also, I think this idea that Putin now sees this as the US as his ally in many ways against Ukraine and Europe. So pretty depressing, but not surprising.
I mean, notable as well that Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, who's made an art out of making a buck off of his father-in-law's presidency, he is there. There are lots of reporting that the sort of oligarch class around Donald Trump these days is keen to sort of do deals with Russia, isn't it?
Yeah, well, one of the people I was speaking to a while ago was saying that, what is this closeness between Trump and Russia? And one theory is that when US banks were not willing to lend to the Trump business empire, that were Russian investors who would do this. I mean, obviously, the point about Steve Witkoff is he is a property mogul. He's made money, in property, and there are opportunities there. So that could be, something behind it. It's also worth noting that, in fact, Witkoff and Kushner were key brokers in the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. So they have had some success. But there is, it just shouts property deal at you, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, that relationship goes back decades. A very suspect and suspicious trip by Trump was made to the USSR in the mid-1980s for business opportunities, which has always been viewed very strangely, but ever since he's been a Russia fan. Well, we'll turn to our next story. Over the border, China. The handling of a spy case here in the UK. There was a lot of controversy about this, but there's a report that's come out.
Yeah, just a bit of background here. So this is, as you might remember, the former parliamentary researcher and a teacher who faced allegations of espionage, spying on behalf of China. Prosecutors unexpectedly dropped the charges and said that the government had not provided sufficient evidence that China represented a threat to the national security of the UK, and that description is key. So yeah, exactly. The Guardian is reporting on the reports on what happened in this particular trial, and is the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy found, according to The Guardian, that there had been systematic failures that created a crisis of public confidence and fueled allegations of conspiracy at the highest levels of government. And this is the idea that the British government, British government officials somehow influenced the trial or encouraged prosecutors to drop the prosecution because they didn't want to upset China when it comes to trade. And I think, obviously, this is a UK story, but I think it has international ramifications because countries around the world will be thinking, China's a spy, an enemy in some ways, espionage, but also a trading partner. So a very difficult decision to make. And of course, this particular case comes in the wake of the fact that the British government has, for the third time now, put off a decision on this Chinese super embassy that might or might not be built in London.
Well, that is some sort of much needed good news for Keir Starmer's government. It's what they were saying, they hadn't interfered. But I want to ask you, because I know that when you were a young man like me, we both worked in Parliament, didn't we? Yeah. And it is still the case, if you're sort of in your first job out of university, Parliament is a really attractive place to work. It can be exciting. It can be, I have to say, quite a dangerous place to work as well. There's sort of no formal HR. It's a very siloed system. But something in the recent weeks that's come out is how vulnerable those staffers are, because there's been warnings to MPs to, slightly interrogate their staff if they feel that they're asking questions about things that they shouldn't be potentially asking about. There is this sort of danger, isn't there, in our democratic system? You've got hundreds of MPs with thousands of staff that they can be vulnerable. They're not very well paid. They might be a bit young, a bit naive.
I mean, it's a great opportunity, as you know. You just suddenly learn so much about the democratic process, don't you? And I'm sure you had the same thing of dealing with inquiries from constituents about all kinds of different issues, which is exciting. You walk past cabinet ministers in that. It's a tremendous opportunity for anybody who manages to do it. But I think, as you say, concerns about how these people were treated. I mean, I was very well treated with the MP I worked for, but I knew other. There were colleagues that I met in the dining rooms and the tea rooms or whatever who were going to the laundrette, who were working 12, 14 hours a day, who were, had no sort of employment protection in that way. And also now, I think, it's always been there, but I think increasingly with the influence of China and Russia being more aggressive, we've seen so many more of the examples of young people who might be vulnerable to any kind of approach and end up being spies.
Turning now, though, to Bulgaria, and Gen Z have managed to force the government to scrap a tax plan.
Yeah, I think this is quite an encouraging story, really. There's always, characterising Gen Z as the people who just, keyboard warriors who just sort of post stuff on Instagram and leave it at that. But the Times is reporting that tens of thousands of this demographic took to the streets of Bulgaria, forcing the government to withdraw an unpopular budget ahead of the country's Eurozone entry in January. They turned out on Monday night for what was described as one of the biggest demonstrations the country has seen since the 1990s. About 50,000 people gathered around a huge plaster pig installed in front of the Parliament building, which I think is perhaps referring either to the Prime Minister or to somebody called Delian Pivsky, who is a controversial oligarch, who's a former media mogul, a national security advisor. He's actually been sanctioned by the US and the UK, the Times points out. This example of people power means that these tax rises and social security contributions have been at least put on hold, if not scrapped. And interesting that the Bulgarian president has posted on Facebook that the Bulgarians have said no to this government. There's only one way out: resignation and early elections. So Bulgaria, a country that faces a number of challenges, not least from Putin, but quite encouraging, I thought.
Yeah, and interestingly, lots of countries and the UK is going to move to votes at 16 by the next election, as it plans to. So then you're going to get Gen Alpha as a political sort of force as well. Let's see whether or not that gets tapped and heads to the streets too. Finally, Sabrina Carpenter, the singer, regular on the Monocle playlist, has been condemning the White House's use of her song. She's the latest artist to do this.
Yeah, exactly. So Politico pointing out that, as you say, that that so many have done it before. According to Politico, she might be man's best friend, and this is the name of her 7th studio album released in the summer, but she certainly isn't the White House's best friend. So she's condemned the White House in response to a video that they posted using one of her songs showing agents arresting individuals as part of Trump's immigration crackdown, and it's her song Juno, which plays in the background, and she has said it's disgusting, and she's very much against it. The White House, again, very, very dignified response. We won't apologise for deporting dangerous criminal illegals, blah blah blah. Anyone who would defend these sick monsters must be stupid, or is it slow? So, as I say, very restrained comment from there. But there's also the Politico makes the point this is just one in a series of confrontations between Trump and singers.
Bruce Springsteen and others.
Exactly, Beyonce. They have indeed. ABBA is another one, Foo Fighters, Kenny Loggins. But of course, the president's friends appears to be the Village People. And one of his favourite songs is YMCA, which he's been seen dancing to. So, do be careful if you're a successful singer.
Simon Brooke, thank you very much. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. 5 hours of talks between President Putin and President Trump's senior negotiator Steve Witkoff appear to have failed to produce a breakthrough on securing a Ukraine peace deal. Putin said changes proposed by Kyiv and Europe to a draft plan were unacceptable, adding if Europe wants to go to war and starts one, we are ready right now. India has ordered all new smartphones to come preloaded with a state-run cybersecurity app. Manufacturers have 90 days to ensure all new devices come with the government's Sancha Sati app, whose functionalities cannot be disabled or restricted. The move in one of the world's largest phone markets, with more than 1.2 billion mobile users, has been criticised by cyber experts, who say it breaches citizens' rights to privacy. And Pope Leo led a silent prayer at the site of the Beirut port explosion and demanded justice for its victims as he wrapped up his 3-day visit to Lebanon. He also met some relatives of the 218 people who were killed by the massive blast on the 4th of August 2020, which devastated a large part of the capital. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Well, it is just gone 8:32 in Brussels and 2:32 in Ottawa, where after months of tough talks, the Canadian government has clinched a deal to join the EU's €150 billion Security Action for Europe programme. Accession to the Loan for Weapons Safe scheme gives Mark Carney's government access to jointly financed defence projects and allows Canadian companies to bid into EU-supported joint procurement projects. Well, we're joined now by Aaron Burnett, Senior Fellow at the Democratic Strategy Initiative in Berlin. Aaron, thanks for speaking to us this morning. How significant a win is this for Canada?
Well, it's a win for a few main reasons. I mean, one of the biggest reasons is even political. Canada's in, my home country is in a certain situation of, very aggressively diversifying away from the U.S. economically, and that does include the field of defense procurement as well. Canada's also in the midst of a decision about whether it will go for a fleet of F-35s, fighter jets sourced from the US, or Gripens sourced from Sweden, or have a mixed fleet. And this particular scheme, or joining this particular scheme, is a way for Mark Carney to send a message saying, well, we have some options on the table that don't necessarily always involve the U.S. either. So it's interesting timing in terms of sending out certain messages to his own public and also to the Americans and to the Europeans. And and Mark Carney has taken quite seriously the idea of deepening partnerships with Europe, and this is just he's done that through various deals on on critical minerals with Germany, for example. He's been to Europe several times, and this is really just the latest win that he can put in that column in that particular way in terms of saying we're realigning a bit.
He spent, of course, several years across this side of the Atlantic as a Bank of England governor. This scheme, though, that he's joined, Canada notoriously has spent under the NATO-required 2% of GDP on defence spending. They're trying to ramp this up. Will this new deal help with that? How will it actually work?
Well, there's a lot of things we're still actually finding out about this particular deal. I mean, the SAFE instrument, in order to be eligible for loans under the SAFE instrument, you can't source more than 35% of components covered under a deal from a non-EU country or from outside of Norway or Ukraine. Now, countries like Canada can apply for certain exemptions under the deal. If you are sourcing from Canadian companies, it might be that exemption is just a little bit higher than that 35% or is included somehow, but we're still looking for information on, what is that number? What is that percentage that is covered by a Canadian exemption? So there's a lot of questions still coming in this deal about what exactly Canada is getting out of it. What exactly are Canadian companies getting out of it? We know that talks with the UK between the EU and the UK about whether they would join SAFE failed because of some of these thorny issues. What would the size of the exemption be for British companies? And they couldn't come to an agreement on that. So there's a lot of unanswered questions still, really about how much this is going to boost readiness in Canada or elsewhere. But for the moment, I think we can really say that it is a political win.
I mean, for Brussels, does sort of getting a G7 partner strengthen the credibility of SAFE? And do you think this might sort of kickstart talks with Britain, which, as you mentioned, is sort of shut out at the moment?
Absolutely, it certainly does. Now, there are two other G7 countries already, other than Canada, in SAFE. Those would be Italy and France. It is interesting who else is missing, though. I mean, Germany, with a famously large defense sector, is actually missing from SAFE, despite being an EU country, for example. So, I mean, having a third G7 country in Canada and, the first non-EU country to join, or the first non-European country to join, certainly is significant. And the EU will certainly count it as a win that it's getting more countries on board and might be able to entice other countries, G7 or UK, to join. But it really remains to be seen whether the gap is just simply too far to bridge, to ensure UK participation. The fee that the EU was asking Britain to put up to be able to participate in this was simply a very steep one, according to the Brits. I mean, the EU was originally asking for somewhere between £4.5 and £6.5 billion from the UK to be able to participate in this instrument. They eventually knocked that down to an ask of $2 billion. That simply was too high for the United Kingdom. And we don't actually know even now precisely how much money Canada has actually committed to putting in. So, whether we are going to see British participation eventually is a very open question.
Aaron Burnett in Berlin, thank you. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Well, let's cross over to the French Riviera, where the international luxury travel market is in full swing. This week, Cannes plays host to some of the world's most exclusive hospitality brands. Earlier, Monocle's Laura Kramer spoke with Tom Rowntree, Vice President of Global Luxury Brands at IHG, at our pop-up radio studio. She began by asking about the IHG resort brand Six Senses, which has a series of major new openings coming in 2026.
We're super excited. So Six Senses, which is really synonymous with the world's most incredible resorts, built on the foundations and principles of sustainability, wellness and crafted experiences, is having a bit of a movement. Yeah, very exciting. So we began a couple of years ago with the opening of Six Senses in Rome, and then more recently with Six Senses in Kyoto. And then next year we'll be opening Six Senses London in Q1 of 2026 in the former Whiteley's building. And we'll then also be opening Six Senses in Dubai on the Palm, and also Six Senses in Milan.
3 openings. It's a lot for you, I have to say. I was wondering, when you decide that you're going to open into a new market, what are the factors that you think, okay, it's ready for a Six Senses now?
That's a great question. Well, it's a number of different things. I mean, any resort or any urban location, but maybe even more so with resorts. So, as I mentioned, Six Senses is a brand that is resort forward, right? We are a resort brand. But what we heard from our guests around the world, and actually hotel owners, is that they wanted Six Senses in certain locations that they travel to. So what we've then looked at is what are the global gateway cities where it makes sense for us to have a Six Senses location. So we won't be in all urban locations. Regent is a brand that will fulfill that need. So it starts off with that first and foremost. And then it comes right down then to the building, the property, the vision for the owner, the micro location within that city. So there's lots and lots and lots of different factors that go into those decisions.
And with IHG, you do have a very big footprint in the Middle East. I think you've just opened, is it the world's tallest hotel?
Absolutely. So we were actually the very first hotel brand to open in the Middle East. We opened the Intercontinental Phoenicia in Beirut in 1961. We then had the very first property open in Dubai, the Intercontinental Dubai, the original one on the creek, and also in Saudi Arabia. So we have a very long history of presence in the Middle East. And I actually spent 14 years of my career in the Middle East region. But yes, you're right. So we have just opened Vignette Collection, which is the latest addition to our luxury portfolio. We've opened Ciel Tower, which is the world's tallest hotel, and altitude swimmers, if ever that is a thing. We have the world's tallest infinity swimming pool in a hotel. So yeah, quite remarkable.
Very respectfully, no thank you. I don't like heights. But good for
I'll
you.
join you in the bar on the ground floor.
We're very happy that you're happy that's happening for you.
It's all about choices.
What do you think about, we're seeing so much travel in that direction, aren't we, in the Middle East? So much hospitality, excitement, lots of brands going in. What do you make of it?
Well, super excited by it. First of all, I think we're very, very fortunate to work in the travel industry. And I think when we have a role to play, which is to further open up destinations to tourism, enable people to connect to different cultures around the world, there's something that's quite joyful of being part of that particular journey. And yeah, absolutely. I think what we've seen as well post-pandemic is that people are not foregoing leisure travel. That is hugely important to one's wellness and one's well-being. So then seeing new destinations being sought after, Saudi Arabia in particular, is very, very exciting. And we'll be opening a Regent in Jeddah next year, which we're very, very excited by, Jeddah being a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a very exciting time.
And are there parts of the world that you feel are maybe still underserved or haven't reached their full potential yet that you would be kind of interested in?
Yeah, always. And I think that is you as a publications as well, incredible journalists that you are. We're all looking at what is the next frontier. And certainly Saudi Arabia is very, very topical. Portugal continues to be in high demand. Not a new frontier, but continues to be in very high demand, as does Japan. The one that's really piquing my curiosity, right, I'm going to tell you now, is, and it has been for a couple of years now, is Albania.
Tell me more.
Yeah, so if you think about where it is from a geography perspective, you've got Croatia, Montenegro, Albania on the Adriatic. The topography is absolutely breathtaking. The history going back to their culture, the history of food, of wine is just very, very rich. And think about all the neighboring countries there, proximity to Greece. It's got all of the ingredients to make a phenomenal tourist destination. And I first went there 2 years ago for the signing ceremony for an Intercontinental we're opening in Tirana. And that property will be opening end of next year. And so very, very excited to see that. But that one I think is one I will put my money on as a future tourist destination.
Now we are heading into, I think it's safe to say, another year of uncertainty, definitely economically, geopolitically. And I wondered, what's the view from where you sit?
I think one of the benefits that we saw coming out of the pandemic, that it enabled people to really understand the value to one's well-being of being surrounded by people you love, and about connecting to the world around us. And that's what's really driven that ongoing growth in luxury leisure travel. And I read a statistic fairly recently that was saying that between 2024 and 2032, the luxury travel sector will almost double in revenue. There's also, you'll probably be aware as well, is that this year is the birth of Generation B. So now we have 7 generations of travellers. So the matures, people born up till 1946, and now Generation B. That's never happened before in the history of travel, ever, that we've had 7 generations travelling. So all of those ingredients absolutely are hopefully painting a rosy picture for the future.
And what trends do you think are then driving the luxury guest experience today, given that there are so many factors, how many different generations that you just alluded to? What's driving that?
Yeah, I think family travel is a really, really big one. And it has been for quite some time now. But then there's behaviour within family travel. So multi-generational travel, very, very, very important. As we as hotels now are thinking about how we design spaces. We're also looking at how we design resorts. So the Regent Phu Quoc in Southern Island of Vietnam, we have 3 7-bedroom beachfront villas, but those 7-bedroom beachfront villas can then connect into other 2- and 3-bedroom villas. So we've got spaces for families to come together.
That's great. And what are you most excited for then in 2026? Direction of travel, if you will.
Obviously, all the incredible openings that we've got going on. So I'm very, very excited by that. I'm also very, very excited by us opening our first members club at Six Senses Place, London, which will be the first time that we've done that as a bit of a proof of concept. So very, very excited by that opening in London. And then in terms of where I'm travelling to.
Yeah, what pool can we find you at?
Wow, my goodness me. Well, always down here and visiting my in-laws in the south of France. So down here at the Carlton Cannes for sure.
That was Tom Rowntree, Vice President of Global Luxury Brands at IHG, speaking to Monocle's Laura Kramer at the International Luxury Travel Market in Cannes. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned.
IQ, EQ, and AI. 3 components key to the craft of innovation at UBS. Because to stay ahead in a rapidly evolving age, you need a partner with decades of experience, endless passion for the work, and a finger on the pulse of leading technologies, bridging human expertise with artificial intelligence, all to elevate you. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Well, it's time now for a roundup of fashion and retail news, and I'm joined in the studio by retail expert and brand consultant Rebecca Tay. Rebecca, thank you for being with us. First of all, Prada has acquired Versace.
Yes, that's right. So this has been a deal that's been in the works for a while, but it is now fully completed. You know, it's a landmark moment. Donatella Versace and obviously her brother, they showed on the runway for 47 years. And last season was the first season that they didn't. And so there's been a lot of news for the brand in general. But I think most experts are saying that this is just the beginning. There's a lot of work to be done at Versace. They have a lot of work to do in terms of reclaiming their market and, you know, proving their relevance, I think, as well. So it's a good challenge, I think, for the Prada Group.
And what's gone wrong and what do Prada plan to do with the label?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think the first things that they've sort of been saying is to sort of reduce their reliance on outlet stores. So they've relied really very heavily since in the last sort of 7 years where they've been owned by the Capri Group in the US. So trying to reduce their reliance on discounting, improve their relevance. So this is an area where it's quite interesting because Prada is known as a minimalist brand. Versace is very much a maximalist brand. And reclaiming some of those brand codes. So they're very much known for the Medusa and their kind of Greek and Mediterranean influences. And obviously their Italian heritage as well. So leaning into those a little bit more, proving that they, have that nostalgic factor that is, very, very popular right now with the younger audiences. But then also on the more operational side, leaning into synergies with Prada Group as well. So I think they've already made some moves in terms of leather manufacturers and leather working groups as well. Kind of, trying to reduce costs there where possible.
And to Paris now, there's been some changeover at LVMH.
Yes. So, I think the Bernard Arnault and the succession discussion is ongoing. People are saying that this isn't really necessarily related to that, but Pietro Beccari, who has been and still will remain the chief executive of Louis Vuitton, has now had a promotion. He's now also the chair and the CEO of the fashion group. So that includes 8 other brands within LVMH. Some big brands as well. So they used to be considered quite small, but it's also Celine, Loewe, Marc Jacobs, Givenchy. It doesn't include Dior. So it does, Dior falls separately. It's under the kind of leather and fashion group. But it does improve and increase his remit, for sure.
And, I mean, how successful was he at Louis Vuitton? Why is he the one that's been picked for this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there were definitely some rumblings that this was going to happen. I think on it personally, the people have been saying that he's probably wanting to move back to Italy at some point, so that might still be in the cards in the next few years. For now, he is US-based. I believe he might be Paris, actually, but he is, credited for turning around and a lot of successes at Louis Vuitton. So, for example, he brought in Pharrell Williams as the head of men's creative designer. He was responsible for spearheading the Takashi Murakami collaboration this year, which really basically saved Louis Vuitton at the beginning of this year. So he has that sort of magic mix of understanding brand and heritage, whilst also kind of keeping an eye on the commercials, for sure.
And we're going to turn to a story about adverts in a second, but another story you flagged is Chanel showing in New York. And I mean, there seems to be a theme that from these stories that a lot of brands are struggling at the moment. Do you think this is sort of recession indicator that we're in right now?
It's, I think a lot of the luxury brands have struggled with China. So China never rebounded. It hasn't rebounded in the same way that a lot of brands were expecting. And at the same time, people have noticed and analysts have noticed that the US is actually a huge market for luxury. So there's a lot of untapped potential in the US. There's a lot of regions within the US. So not just your New York and LA, but also Texas, for example. This is a huge market with, as I said, a lot of untapped potential. So yes, Chanel.
Anywhere where there's a real Housewives franchise, maybe.
Yes, exactly.
And finally, it's December. The Christmas ads are all out, and you think there's a nostalgia theme being detected?
Yeah, it's being called sort of the Ralph Lauren Christmas. So whether or not it's actually Ralph Lauren, it's sort of the Ralph Lauren aesthetic, which really leans into these traditional British and American styles. So it's
very much the McAllister house from Home Alone. Exactly. I was in a store yesterday, store after store, and it was like plaid everywhere, exactly. Heavy colours. Like it's a pivot back, isn't it?
100%. It's the sort of deep red velvet, and forest greens, and a lot of shearling. And I think Ralph Lauren himself, his Christmas ads are very kind of Colorado.
They've got a huge pop-up in Sloane Square at the moment, haven't they?
They do, exactly. And you can sort of experience the authentic Ralph Lauren Christmas. But obviously other brands are leaning to this as well. So Burberry, obviously as a British brand, has a lot of heritage to kind of lean into as well. Yeah. They've tapped Jennifer Saunders from AbFab, so kind of leaning into that nostalgia of people who loved the show. And then American Eagle, a little bit of a younger brand. They've got Martha Stewart headlining their Christmas campaign, where she's sort of
really,
she decorated she's kind of wrapped a turkey in denim, which is their their latest rendition of their great jeans tagline for this year.
And they're still sticking with that tagline?
They are, apparently. This is for Thanksgiving at least, but she is still, very much on their social channels as the front woman, Martha Stewart.
Wow, okay. You think you'd run a mile from that campaign, given what happened to Sydney Sweeney and her career since. Well, Rebecca Tate, thank you very much. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. And finally this morning, the 2025 Copenhagen Index of the world's top 100 cities transforming their streets for cycling has been released. This year's report has a global outlook ranking cities by region, though the top spots are still dominated by European cities. To discuss, we're joined from Zurich by urbanist and Monocle contributing editor Jessica Bridger. Jessica, thanks for speaking with us. So take us through the top of the table.
Good morning. So the top of the table, as you said, is dominated by Europe. So we have Utrecht in place 1, Copenhagen in 2, Ghent in 3, Amsterdam in 4, and Paris in 5. Here in Zurich, we're number 22, although Bern in Switzerland, it takes number 20. And I think the interesting thing about this list is that they've taken quantitative and qualitative kind of real-world conditions to assess which cities make cycling safe, convenient, and can mainstream it.
And I think that top 5 is really interesting because the top 4, Denmark, Holland, they are famously cycling cities. They're also on the smaller end. But Paris in particular is a real success story for cyclists and pedestrians as well. It's made massive moves when it comes to sort of reshaping, it's a mega city, but it's reshaped its landscape, hasn't it? Shutting down whole streets and boulevards just for cyclists and pedestrians.
Absolutely. And I think that we see that these regulatory frameworks that support cycling, in addition to the infrastructure, are a major thing that accomplishes many cities' goals of increasing cycling as part of the modal share of people commuting, people running errands. And Paris, as you said, has been doing an excellent job of making space on the street, but also forwarding policies and forwarding different kinds of initiatives that allow, for instance, parents to cycle children to school, to allow recreation to happen on streets, especially in the weekends, shutting down boulevards and things like this. And I think that there's many cities that have done similar things, that have similar initiatives that are now gaining a lot of momentum. And I think part of the thing that's making these initiatives gain momentum is not only the public desire for that, the desire on the part of kind of city legislators to encourage that, but also the introduction of products such as electric bicycles. We've seen that market explode. It's going to continue rising. It's currently at $54 billion estimated as the total e-bike market, and it's supposed to rise to about $87 billion by 2032. And that's massive. You can't have these changes without the technologies that allow people to adopt better ways to move in cities.
E-bikes, they are quite successful in some cities, but there are big problems building, particularly in London, where there's been a real deluge. There isn't kind of a sort of city hall control of them. It's council by council, so you might be cycling along in one borough and then all of a sudden the e-bike stops when you hit another borough. Complaints about them sort of building up on pavements and things. Who is getting it right in terms of e-bikes?
That's tough. I think that Zurich is actually doing a good job, or Switzerland overall, requiring a lot of e-bike drivers to kind of license their bikes, to kind of put in, again, a regulatory framework that controls the use of these bicycles. These bicycles have top speeds that are well beyond a normal cycle. There was a recent study in one of the newspapers here in Switzerland looking at the incidence of accidents of people over 60 using these bicycles who are maybe accomplished cyclists who are used to cycling as a commuting method, but on the other hand, they are not used to the speeds and the reaction times required by a bicycle that's going 45 kilometers per hour.
And the braking
on the
distances.
roads. Yes, exactly. And so it's kind of, we need better frameworks for across the mobility spectrum. We're seeing an explosion of different modes, right? Things that land between the normal kind of quote unquote analog bicycle and the car. And we need to not only create frameworks that support the development of these products, whether it's micro cars, small cars, bikes, e-bikes, delivery vehicles that are e-powered or powered by foot pedals. And we need to encourage them, but also have the legislation to make them safe and make room for them on the street profiles in cities. How do you slot in alternative forms of transportation into cities? And I think we often forget that bicycles, even in the Netherlands, they have 3 out of 5 of the top spots on that list done by Copenhagen Eyes. That infrastructure was not always there. That was something that was built out in the 1970s. So infrastructure can also change with the times, with the products, with the legislation, with the public demand for alternative modes of transportation.
Jessica Bridger, thank you very much for that. Well, that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers Chris Chermak and Angelica Jopson, our researcher Joanna Moser, and our studio manager Elliot Greenfield, with editing assistance by Christy O'Grady. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday London time. I'll be back tomorrow with The Globalist at the same time. I'm Vincent McAviney. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.
With UBS, you have a truly global partner, incorporating new technologies, innovative approaches, and unexpected opportunities, leading you to insights that help answer the questions that matter, delivered with passion, care, and unmatched expertise. Because it's about rising with the dawn each day, knowing that we can do even better. That's what banking is to us. Not just work, but a craft. UBS. Advice is our craft.